Hey everyone, coming to you again from super sunny the Ulster here in the south of France. I saw this morning as I was having my coffee an interesting CNBC segment with James Pethokoukis from the American Enterprise Institute. I've looked into his research a bit, and I think there might be even more for me to contest here, maybe some more videos directed towards some of his takes on AI as well. But for the purposes of this video, I wanted to address briefly, it was an interesting segment really on the political ramifications and the business ramifications of the new EPA rules around emissions regulations for automakers. I thought it was fascinating because obviously CNBC is ostensibly supposed to be a channel with economic and business insights, and I thought they had sort of made what I interpreted as a large error in thinking about how businesses deal with regulations and the quote unquote uncertainty in the markets, or an uncertain environment around certain regulatory structures. Obviously, with the EPA's new rules or new proposed rules, certainly you're going to see some pushback from the business community. But I thought it was really interesting as the conversation progressed. A few folks, James included, made the point that as this regulatory oversight could be rolled back at some point in the future, and so we don't really know how effective such a rule might be going forward. And I think this kind of fundamentally misunderstands how businesses deal with regulatory institutions and the uncertainty around regulatory oversight. And the way that it misunderstands this, the way that this conversation sort of, I think, misunderstands or misunderstood how businesses deal with regulatory oversight is essentially, if you're Ford or you're Stellantis or you're the Volkswagen Group, you have to predicate your future business decisions, your quarter by quarter rulemaking, your quarter by quarter decision making. This is all going to be based on the maximalist interpretation of a regulatory environment for a particular polity in which you're operating, right? Whether it's in California or France or wherever, right? You have to make the decision based on the maximalist perspective, the maximalist interpretation of the rules, such as they are and such as they will be, so that you're not caught you're not caught unawares. You're not left out in the cold and dealing with some kind of new regulation that you didn't anticipate. And this is part of the lobbying feedback process, right? And this is really, part of what's interesting about the coverage that CNBC gave this story was they were saying, this is really going to, along with gas stove gate, these kinds of things. Obviously, the Republicans are going to take this and run with it and make it part of the culture war, for the upcoming election, which I think is an obvious piece of analysis, and certainly I think would be true. Whenever the facts disagree with their ideology, the Republicans will make it part of the culture war. But in this circumstance, I think this is really an administration, in the Biden administration. I don't think anybody outside of a Fox News editorial booth would say this is, some kind of Marxist, socialist organization, right? These people are in the Biden administration and in the EPA are in constant conversation with large industries, in the United States. They are making rules. They are trying to make rules that are compatible with, sort of a broadly neoliberal, center democratic perspective on the environment, on energy regulation, these kinds of things. This is not a radical administration, really, by any stretch of the imagination, right? Only to someone sitting at a Trump rally is the Biden administration going to be seen as anything close to radical in any way, right? And that, is another point here, that this is really, I think, from an objective perspective, a regulatory decision that is broadly compatible with what all these automakers, sort of probably Toyota, right, who are sort of doing some baffling things, as Electric Viking has talked about, in terms of their long-term EV decision-making and resource allocation strategies, making, I think, a huge mistake in not diving into EVs more readily and more forcefully. But, saying, okay, you have to have this level of emissions reduction by 2032 or whatever, they're already there, right? They're already, if you're Ford, if you're GM, right, they have seen the writing on the wall for several years. Certainly, you look at the car that I'm sitting in now, a Hertz rental car, for fleet adoption, right, which I've mentioned in a different video, I'll link above. For fleet adoption, this is going to be hugely driven in the U.S. I think EV adoption will be hugely driven by fleet adoption because these cars are so much lower overhead. The upkeep for them is so much lower. And so the numbers just make sense for a Hertz or another rental car company. So it's a bit of a digression, but essentially, the point I think that they're missing in this CNBC panel is that these companies, whether it's a rental car company, whether it's an automaker, they are looking at the regulatory environment and saying, first of all, this rule from the EPA isn't that incompatible with what we've already been planning to do, right, in terms of our production. Second of all, whether it gets rolled back in 2 years by a judge in Texas who's ideologically opposed to, renewable energy and electric vehicles for whatever dumb reason that Texas judges seem to be, or whether it's God forbid, a Republican president in the next cycle comes out on top and rolls back such a rule, it doesn't really matter. These are all uncertain things, right? This is all stuff that these companies are going to have some probability assigned to, but if this rule comes to pass, right, through the EPA, and in 2 years it gets rolled back, well, that's still 2 years in which it's been, in place as a potentiality in the future, right? So the company is going to prepare for that eventuality and do its due diligence and do its preparation for its to try to get to a future state that is in the best interest of its shareholders, and that's going to be true whether the rule is there in 5 or 10 years or not, right? So that's really the first point, is like we would expect a higher level of sort of nuance and business understanding from a outlet like CNBC, right? This is supposed to be the one thing that they're good at, and I thought that was surprising. Secondarily, this wasn't James's point. This was another panelist's point, whose name I'm forgetting, but she noted, that there's sort of this inherent classism in place, and this is something you'll see. I think you definitely will see going into the next election cycle. Is the Republicans will continue to try to sort of claim that they're the party of the working class, and obviously that's objectively, empirically, statistically on its face pretty ridiculous. But you'll continue to see this sort of dual messaging where the Republican Party will claim to be, more business friendly, but also sort of continue to try to hold on to the populist edge that Trump, in some ways, granted them. And her point in this panel was, well, folks pushing for EV adoption, they're really clueless because only in these big red states, I think she called them large states or something like that, like California isn't a huge state, or even Washington State is a huge state. But these large states, in parentheses, large equals good, right? But her point was these large states, folks have to drive 50 miles for a commute, and there's no way that anybody in these progressive bastions on the coast, which is the only place that progressives live in her mind, there's no way they'll understand this, right? And this is just a ridiculous idea, both, I think, empirically from how the ranges of these vehicles, but also, we just have to do away with this idea. I lived in Seattle for a decade, and there are many conservative people who live there, right? And certainly living in other states in the South, there are many progressives who live there, or many states in the Midwest where there are, obviously the state and local governments tend to be conservative because there's more conservative people, but there are many, many progressives living in these areas, and vice versa, right? So dividing the country up this way is just more of this really divisive rhetoric, and frankly, it just has nothing to do with the adoption of these EV technologies, which are, do you think that Ford or Stellantis are driving for the adoption of these technologies, or Hertz is driving for the adoption of these technologies because out of the goodness of their heart? No, they're superior technologies in basically every way, and the infrastructure needs some time to roll out. But we really need to, I think, in general, get away from this kind of thinking that the country is divided in that way and separated in that way. And we also certainly need to continue to keep that kind of rhetoric out of the discussion as much as possible of the adoption of EVs. This is something that we just can't afford to politicize. So anyway, that's about it from me. I want to kind of keep these a little bit shorter. I know, as my father always says, I love the sound of my own voice, maybe hence the YouTube channel. But as always, I do really appreciate you watching, mostly and maybe entirely in some ways, because I really appreciate your comments, and I really look forward to reading them, and they give me a lot to think about. So I'm looking forward to that again as well, and appreciate it as always. Have a good one.